Welcome to my podcast, and thank you so much for joining me. I'm actually sitting with my guest in a different room in the castle because it's rather busy in so much of the castle today. My guest today is an amazing man, a Concorde pilot called John Tye. John, thank you so much for joining me here today. It's lovely to meet you. It's a bit of a muddle, so I'm apologising for that and being in a different place.
No problem at all, and thank you so much for inviting me. There's clearly something going on this week. The car parks are full of trucks and all sorts of paraphernalia.
Yes, there's no place for us really at the moment. But John, I first met you through Steve Bohill-Smith and probably Rick Peacock-Edwards and all the wonderful, marvellous men in their flying machines. And I was introduced to you and some of the other Concorde pilots because you once flew this extraordinary machine, Concorde. And for those who are listening, I think it was developed in about 1969, if I remember my facts rightly. I think Steve Bohill-Smith will have told me then, and then flew in the 70s. How long did it fly for?
Well,
Concorde?
yeah, you're quite right. It first flew on the 2nd of March 1969, the very first test flight. And then there was 7 years of testing, and it went into service on the 21st January 1976, and then flew for an incredible 27 years.
Wow. In fact, I know my father flew on Concorde a few times. Perhaps you might have flown him. And you've written a wonderful book, Life of a Concorde Pilot, which I do recommend. I imagine you can buy it on Amazon. But it is an extraordinary plane, an extraordinary life. This plane was built in 1969, and you were flying at Mach 1, faster than the speed of a bullet?
Absolutely, yeah. Mach 2, so twice the speed of sound we fly at, faster than the speed of a bullet, 23 miles a minute, and a mile every 2.5 seconds. Absolutely phenomenal. Somebody pointed out the other day, who'd just run the London Marathon, that if they'd done that in Concorde, they could have done it in a minute.
Goodness me.
Incredible. So the point being, I start my talks by suggesting to the audience that Concorde was possibly the greatest icon of the 20th century. She first flew, as we said, in March 69. The Americans put a man on the moon for the first time in July 69. And there's people at NASA who've actually said that they believe that what we did with Concorde was a greater technical achievement than their moon landings. We'd only just got colour television, and that was on BBC Two. It was remarkable.
It was remarkable. I've been so lucky to meet yourself and Steve and all the other marvellous men in their flying machines because of the history of aviation at Highclere, given Geoffrey de Havilland first flew from here in 1910, which he always said, however long he lived and whatever he achieved, which was much, that getting his extraordinary plane off the ground, those first 4 inches in September 1910, was the greatest moment of his life. And he went on to develop the Mosquito for World War II, and then after that, obviously, Comet. A remarkable man. And from that to the Mosquitoes to then the events we've had to raise money for those who serve and those who save. And then I feel that I've been lucky enough to look into the world of Concorde and its pilots. And in the world today, when we're trying to fly to space or whatever else, I feel that Concorde was so far ahead of its time. It was the most superb piece of engineering.
It was a time machine. You know, we'd leave Heathrow at 10:30 in the morning, fly faster than the Earth is rotating, and arrive in New York at 9:30 in the morning, an hour before you've left. And back in the day, there was even a helicopter service from Kennedy Airport to downtown Manhattan. So 80% of our passengers on Concorde were businessmen and women who could get to New York early in the morning, take the helicopter downtown and do whatever they did, buy companies and do multi-million-dollar deals, and then fly back to the UK again in something like 3 hours across the Atlantic Ocean. Absolutely remarkable. The quickest flight time across the Atlantic was in 1996, I think it was. 2 hours, 52 minutes and 59 seconds. And that was on Concorde Alpha Delta from New York to Heathrow. And that's the very aeroplane that's now sitting in New York on the Intrepid. as a wonderful exhibit. So for anybody visiting New York, they must go and see that record-breaking Concorde.
Who was the pilot?
That was Captain Leslie Scott, and the first officer was Tim Orchard, and I can't remember right now the flight engineer's name, but and Captain Les Scott actually lives in New York, so he's often seen on board that very aeroplane with tourists.
Did you always want to be a pilot, John?
It's funny, I did. I had a great interest for aeroplanes growing up. I've always had problems with my legs, so I could never run or walk properly at school and things like that. I always underestimated my abilities, but I joined British Airways in the summer of 1976 through an advert on Capital Radio in London. And it was the most junior job in the airline. It was as a clerk in the accounts department, sticking labels on bits of paper. And it was meant to be a summer holiday job before going to university. I had a place at City University. But 46 years later, I retired as a senior training captain on the Boeing 777 without a degree. I never went to university. So what happened was, after a few weeks doing this clerical job, I got the opportunity to transfer to another job in the airline, where they gave me a uniform and a van and a walkie-talkie, and I got to go on aeroplanes and put all the maps and books in the cockpit and meet real pilots and flirt with stewardesses. And what 19-year-old wants to give that up to go to university? So when I met these real pilots, I thought, you're not a Superman. I can do that job. I'm going to go and do that. And so that's kind of a bit of a turning point. And one of the pilots I got to know took me on a ride with him on a flight deck of a Vanguard propeller aircraft down to Italy. And I was in the cockpit and I saw how it all worked, and we flew low over the Alps. So I was bitten at that stage. And then I applied to the College of Air Training in Hamble near Southampton, which is where British Airways sponsored their pilot training courses. I got accepted for training there in March of 79. And I'll never forget it. They said to me, we'll let you know when your training course is going to start, John. And they wrote to me, the letter came on the 27th of September 1979, saying, terribly sorry, we're not having any more training courses. There's been a downturn in the industry. We're stopping all training. And the words were, we suggest you pursue any plans you may have for an alternative career. So I was 22 years old by then, and moaned and groaned and mumbled and grumbled, and my girlfriend at the time, now my long-suffering wife Lynn, bought my first flying lesson at High Wycombe at the British Airways Flying Club, kicked me up the proverbial backside and said, stop talking about it and get on with it. And the rest is history.
How extraordinary. So from there you went into various lessons which you bought yourself, and were you then able later on to get into a training course?
Yes, what happened was it took me, I got my private pilot's licence. In those days, once armed with that, you could then gain a little bit of experience, build your hours up, and be trained and qualified as a flying instructor. So when you're a flying instructor, you're not paying for the flying, the students are, but you're building your hours up. So I was still working at British Airways in various other jobs along the way, and it took me 6 years to build up enough flying hours. And then I sat lots of exams and did flying tests and got my commercial pilot's licence, which I got in 87. And I couldn't fly for British Airways because I didn't have any experience by then. But I got my big break with a charter airline in the UK called Dan Air.
Wow, I remember Dan Air.
Yes. Everybody says that. I always stop when I mention Dan Air, which is a great airline here in the UK. Did charter flights, and they gave me my big break. A lady phoned me up, Alison. In fact, funny enough, I'll be meeting her for lunch soon because we're back in touch. She said, John, we'd like to offer you a job, but there's a catch. I said, what's that? She said, well, normally we put our new pilots straight onto the turboprop, the HS Hawker Siddeley 748. But we're going to use you as a guinea pig. We're going to put you onto the Boeing 727 three-engine jet. We've never done that before, so we want to see how you get on, which is a real honour. So I was a guinea pig, and thankfully it went well. So I did 2 great years with Dan Air on the 727. And then with a really heavy heart, because they were a great company to work for. They bent over backwards, and I've written many stories about what they did for me. I applied to British Airways to go back. And I was very much undecided as to whether to stay at Dan or go try and get back to BA. But Lynn helped me out with stating the obvious, really, which was by then, she said, you always wanted to fly a Concorde, and you're certainly not going to do that in Dan Air, are you? So I applied to BA, got back, and flew the 747 for 9 years. And then my name was on a waiting list for 9 years to get onto the Concorde, and it happened.
And that's a whole training programme within itself, presumably.
Yeah, the Concorde training course was the longest and toughest in aviation, without doubt. Bearing in mind, we're going on to it as very experienced airline pilots. So the whole training course was 6 months long, so roughly 3 times as long as a training course on a conventional airliner. You start off with 6 weeks in the classroom, all chalk and talk as we call it. And I nearly quit on day one when the instructor came in and gave us an overview of the systems we were going to be learning, the electrics, the hydraulics and the fuel system, for example. And he said, Concorde's got 13 fuel tanks and they're numbered 1 to 11. How does that work? But he did explain that there was a 5A and a 7A, so I stuck it out a bit longer. But it was a tough training course, lots of exams. And then 19 sessions in the simulator and learning how to operate the aeroplane in normal and abnormal conditions, supersonic and subsonic. Then going off what we call base training, where we took an empty Concorde out of service and we take it off and practice circuits and bumps, touch and goes, so we can get the hang of the takeoffs and the landings. Long training course.
And then was your first flight to New York?
It was indeed, yes, yeah. So by then, that must have been February 1999. So we have done our base training. We ended up doing ours in Seville. There's a long story behind that, but we're in the sunshine in Seville. And then we're now qualified Concorde pilots once we've flown the aeroplane. So we've learned how it works in the classroom.
Yeah.
We've been in the simulator and we've now flown it for the first time. So the Civil Aviation Authority stamped Concorde on the back of your licence that you're now eligible to fly it. But all we've done is flown it around the circuit in Seville. So then the final part of the training is indeed what we call route training or line training, where we fly with training captains and supervisory pilots on the route. So my first flight was to New York with 85 passengers behind me.
How amazing.
Off I went. And then we flew backwards and forwards to New York several times to just get the hang of operating Concorde in the commercial environment on the edge of space at twice the speed of sound.
So you're looking up at the darkness of the infinite space.
Absolutely.
And presumably you can see the curvature of the Earth.
Yeah, you can see the curvature of the Earth. The sky is black above you. It's minus 70 degrees centigrade outside. We're flying across the Earth faster than a rifle bullet. And what was incredible, we would take off in the evening on the evening flight to New York. That would leave Heathrow at 7 o'clock in the evening. So in the spring and the autumn, it's dark leaving Heathrow. Again, flying faster than the Earth is rotating, it would get sunny again. We would see the sunrise in the west. That won't be seen again. Incredible.
John, you'd been on the simulator, you'd been in the classroom, but what was it like when you first walked onto the Concorde plane and you were going to do a circuit around Seville?
It was probably, without doubt, the best day in my aviation life. Concorde had never been to Seville before. There were thousands of people there watching us. We were there for 3 or 4 days. 3 TV crews were on site filming our every move. And I got into this aeroplane. It was just before sunset on a Thursday afternoon, if I remember rightly. And we were only going to have time to do 1 circuit before the sunset. We had to stop. We were going to do the rest the next day. We practiced it over and over again in the simulator, but the simulator can't prepare you for the noise, the smell. The acceleration is absolutely phenomenal. You get pushed back in your seat, and the flight deck, I hadn't expected this, bounces up and down slightly. You're sitting 37 feet in front of the nose wheel, so the tiniest bump on the runway gets amplified, and as well as being pushed into your seat, you're thrown backwards as well. Sorry, up and down. And so the training captain gave me a warning that they ran a book on the greatest altitude reached by a novice Concorde pilot on his attempt to stop at 2,000 feet on his first takeoff. And I was told the record stood at 7,200 feet. So there was no pressure because it's like a rocket. It's 3, 2, 1 now. It's full power with reheat. These enormous flames leaping out the back of the aeroplane. The acceleration is phenomenal. And seconds later, you're easing back on the control column to take this aeroplane into the air for the very first time. It's a precision exercise with 3 of you starting your stopwatches simultaneously. Various things get called out. Power set. 100 knots, V1, rotate. I threw a couple of expletives in there as well on my very first one, because it was just unbelievable. It took me a while to come down literally after that. We landed, and then it was also a good introduction to the high-profile role of the job, because I was sitting there just having flown this amazing aeroplane for the first time. And Mike Bannister, our chief pilot, appeared on the flight deck with a TV crew. And I was interviewed live on Spanish television about what it was like to fly Concorde for the very first time.
Wow.
Absolutely phenomenal experience.
We spent our holidays in Cornwall, and I think that sometimes we used to hear the bang as you were off out over the sea, presumably, and you were heading into Mach 1 and Mach 2. Was there a bang at both times? We could hear it on the ground.
Yeah, what happened was we leave Heathrow and fly subsonic over land. Yeah. We could only fly supersonic over the oceans because of exactly what you've just described. So we would accelerate at a point in the Bristol Channel, so close to where you were on holiday. And then we would create a sonic boom. It's not a one-off event. Once you're flying a little faster than Mach 1, you create this sonic boom, and you carry it with you across the ocean. So it's there all the time. Right. So if you were sitting on a boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean and we went over the top, at anything above about Mach 1.1, so we cruise at Mach 2, you would hear that sonic boom. Once you slow down and were back below about Mach 1.1, you'd stop creating this boom. So by the time we were subsonic, there was no boom to be heard at all. We used to do a wonderful package with Cunard, and passengers would fly one way to New York with Concorde and cruise back on the QE2, or vice versa. And so what was a real feature was that the passengers on the QE2, who were either about to fly on Concorde or had just experienced it, would come out on deck when Concorde was going over the top, and they would hear the sonic boom in the middle of the Atlantic. That was quite special.
And how many times a week did Concorde fly?
Twice a day to New York.
Twice a day
to New York. It was and it was a great success story. And then
I think it was great for flying the flag for Britain too.
It really was
unbelievable for what we could achieve. I know it was an Anglo-French production, wasn't it?
Very much so. Yeah.
But which was very important to mention. And the name Concorde, I love. It's so important, ever more important as we seem to struggle forward in our world today. But in every way, it spoke so well of what we can do. Absolutely, what we could do in this country. And I help out at Brooklands Museum in Surrey, and we used to call them STEM events: science, technology, engineering and maths. And now it's the Innovation Academy. So we get young people to come along, and we encourage them to go into these sort of careers. And they stand underneath Concorde, and they look up at it as if it's something out of the future rather than the past. It's incredible. I've been in the one in Duxford with Steve Bohill-Smith, which was quite fun, and he was clambering into the cockpit, so I clambered in. They very kindly let me clamber in next door. And there's one in Brooklyn, one in New York. Are there any others around? Yes, in the United States there's one in Seattle as well, the British Airways one in Seattle. There's a couple of Air France aeroplanes as well in the United States. In the UK, there's Filton. Aerospace Bristol have done a wonderful display down at Filton. That's inside. And similarly at Manchester, there's one there undercover at Manchester Airport, and another one at East Fortune in Scotland, in Glasgow. Right. And they've done great displays, There's also one still sitting at Heathrow, and people say it's sad that it's sitting out there in all weathers. But the other side of the coin is that thousands of people see it every day when they're taking off from Heathrow. Yes, so they're scattered around. British Airways still own all our aeroplanes, and they're lent to these various museums so that future generations can marvel at supersonic travel. Of what we actually did. Extraordinary, isn't it? You've told me about all these extraordinary planes of the future, which are now in museums. So it seems quite an extraordinary juxtaposition, because it is back to the future. They are well ahead of our time today and in museums. How do you feel about that? Incredibly, it's over 20 years since Concorde last flew. October 2003 was when the last 3 aeroplanes landed at Heathrow, all within 5 minutes of one another. And then over the month that followed, they were taken off to those museums. And the last ever Concorde landed on the 26th of November 2003. So there isn't a child on Earth who's ever seen a Concorde fly. And people say,
we took a big step backwards that day. Isn't it ridiculous that we can no longer fly passengers at twice the speed of sound? I take the view that whilst that's true, we've actually turned our attention, our research, our development down a different, a more appropriate path than the modern world, because aeroplanes now are much more environmentally friendly. We're doing a tremendous amount with sustainable fuels and aircraft noise and things like that. So you look at modern airliners and they're made of composites and they're far more environmentally friendly. So that's where we've gone with development in aviation. We don't have a supersonic airliner, but we've got far cleaner, better aeroplanes for the modern world.
And it must have been an extraordinary band of fellow pilots, because it was presumably compared to working in the whole of BA, a small number of pilots, English or French, with whom you were consistently flying every day.
Absolutely, yes. It was. There's been thousands of subsonic pilots in BA right now. Today, there's probably over 4,000 pilots again now. But in the whole 27 years that Concorde was in service, there were only ever 134 of us who had the privilege to fly Concorde. So it was a day out with your mates every time you went to work.
How amazing. And the camaraderie must have been extraordinary, actually.
It really was. It was great. Great bunch of people. And we were all of the same ilk, of course. I won't explain in detail how a pilot's career works right now, but you went on Concorde because of your love of the aeroplane.
Yes.
Whereas some pilots might choose to fly the 747 because they wanted to go around the world, or they wanted to earn lots of money, or whatever. But you went on Concorde for the love of the aeroplane. So we all had that in common. And it was
slightly different.
And we never, ever stopped realising what a great privilege it was.
And so after Concorde, were you still flying with British Airways, and you went?
Yes. So I came off Concorde in the summer of 2000, when the aircraft was grounded temporarily after the tragedy in Paris.
Yes.
The aircraft was modified to make sure that sequence of events that caused that accident could never happen again. And we went back into service for another 10 years. But by then, because we'd sat at home for 3 months, not flying, quite understandably, British Airways wanted us to earn a living. So I transferred to the Airbus short-haul fleet, where I quickly became a captain and a training captain. So I stayed there. That was a good career move for me. And I flew the Airbus all around Europe, training others as well. And then I moved on to the Boeing 777 back to long haul for the last 12 or 15 years, I think it was, of my career. And 65 is the compulsory retirement age, so I stayed there right till I retired at December 2022. So
wow.
It's a fantastic career. Yeah. Remember, I only went for a summer holiday job before going to university.
Amazing.
46 years.
It's extraordinary how life turns out, isn't it, for all of us, actually. Yeah. What I love about your story, and please, if you, again, do read his book, Life of a Concorde Pilot, because it's full of the opportunities which come, however challenging life seems. There are opportunities there if you just look for them and take them. This
is exactly my point. The full title of the book is also From the Orphanage to the Edge of Space, because I started off in life with nothing, not even parents. I was given up by my mother at birth. She was unable to keep me for various reasons. I've been quite open about everything in an inspirational way. And I spent the first few weeks, months in a children's home, in an orphanage. I don't even know where exactly. I'm still working on that research. And then I was adopted by 2 wonderful, wonderful parents, Mum and Dad. Took me in, and my life would have been so different without them. The opportunities they gave me. I never had a wealthy upbringing. I've always had problems with my legs, as I've said, but I met the medical requirements to be an airline pilot. So what I've written is inspirational to inspire young people, exactly as you said. But I got the first draft of my book, which I didn't intend to publish. It was meant to be for future generations of my family. My grandson's 9, and he thinks I'm a silly old fool, probably. But I wanted him to know one day when I'm gone and he's older that what Grandad actually did was something quite special. So that's why I've written about it. But I showed the first draft to a friend of mine who's a retired sixth form teacher from a prestigious girls' school in Bournemouth. And she doesn't like flying. She doesn't know a vast amount about aeroplanes. She doesn't like flying. And I said, Jane, what do you think? And she said, well, you've put this bit at the end about everybody can achieve their ambitions if they work hard enough. She said, nowadays we just modify that a little bit. She said, those ambitions have got to be realistic. And she knew about my legs. And she said, for example, you could never have been a ballet dancer. So you'll see reference to me not being able to be a ballet dancer. But the main thing is that young people, we've only got one life.
Yes.
One shot at it. It's not a dress rehearsal. All those cliches come out. And what's been amazing since the book came out, again, I was encouraged to publish it. I didn't intend to. For example, I've had several stories like this, but a 19-year-old lad got in touch recently. He'd read it as somebody bought it for him at an event I did last October. He'd applied to British Airways, who've just started recruiting pilots again for the first time in years. And he hadn't gone to university, and he got accepted. And he told me he read 10 pages of my book before going in for his final interview for this British Airways pilot jobs. They took in 100 people out of 20,000 applicants. And I met up with him just a couple of weeks ago, and he's on the first training course going
How
through.
amazing.
So it is inspiring young people. I've met a lady
I think it's
the other
about
day.
not giving up as well, isn't it? Because
Absolutely.
I think so many people, I was listening to someone who said, well, she thought she wasn't sure what she wanted to do, so she might start, but she was worried she might give up after 6 months. Well, that's just so not the way to go.
No.
It's about not giving up.
No.
And I always remember, Winston Churchill, he said some really useful things, having had a varied school career with varied reports, which always give me hope. But he did say, when he was asked to give a speech, just 3 words repeated 3 times, and that was it: never give up.
Yes.
Never give up, never give up. And certainly here at Highclere, I have never given up. And sometimes it seems overwhelming, but if you still put one foot in front of another, it's amazing how somehow a door opens. But you have to be walking and at the door in order for it to be opening.
That's a really good way of putting it. I'm going to steal that if you don't mind.
Oh, yes, do.
But it is fantastic, and I know what you do here and how much you and all the team work to keep Highclere going and for it to not just keep going but to flourish. And absolutely the hurdles that have been put in your way. We met when COVID came along and we've discussed what the effects that had here. And you've got to keep overcoming these hurdles. And
there are a lot of hurdles and unseen elephant traps full of water. but yes, definitely. Yeah. But it's the same. And I find I trained as a chartered accountant, which I mentioned to you. So firstly, here I'm always trying to remove the risk or some of the risk, because you need to or understand the risk and then reduce the risk in order to focus on where you should be going rather than the wrong direction. And again, I know that when you're flying a plane, you need to have understood many of the eventualities so that when something unforeseen happens, you've got the skill set to immediately analyse and remove some of the risk from it because you've got the skill set there.
Absolutely, and you're planning in advance. You spend most of your career as an airline pilot planning for something that you hope will never happen. Yeah. And it's all about what we train nowadays, having spent all these years as a training captain, it's the human side of things. Aeroplanes are reliable. They're great bits of equipment, unlike the early days when engines would fail regularly and bits would fall off. But nowadays, the aeroplanes are fine. It's humans. We've got to make sure they're communicating well, working well as a team, managing workload effectively, and always having a plan B and a plan C up their sleeves. Yeah.
And I think it's making sure people feel quite up. I think there's an expectation in today's world that we should all be happy. And I think we all just need to have a more pragmatic approach to life, and you have moments of tremendous happiness. And for me, it's sometimes sitting outside at the end of a day and just looking out over the garden with a glass of wine or a cup of tea or whatever it is. That is a happy moment, but you don't have a happy moment all the time. And I think some of the social media and the influences around lead one to believe that you should all be at that adrenaline level of being happy, which if you're an airline pilot, I'd rather you weren't. I'd rather you were level. So it's again managing those human emotions, which we're trying to manage here as well. It's fun, and you can be happy when Downton are around. They're not around all the time, and I'm quite sure for the Downton film crew, it's quite challenging moments. It's not always happy moments, when they're doing a scene for the umpteenth time, or they're trying to be outside for the one time like today when it's about rain.
Yeah, I mean, nowadays, social media, there's a lot of good things about it. I'm not going to get into discussion about that. I do use it occasionally, but it does put a lot of pressure, particularly on young people. And I was very aware that when I was just finishing the book that I was telling funny stories, I was telling about all the good times, but I've put a little bit in the end about how, behind the scenes, we've all had pressures and things to overcome. And one really good thing about this modern world is we're far more aware of mental health issues, and we're not afraid to talk about them. It's out there in the open now. And, I got very upset at the end of my career because I loved it so much. I felt so privileged. And the day I retired, I went home and cried because that was the end of an era for me. But yeah, it's not all highs and being happy, but it is important to have those happy places. And
because again, I think it's managing the different eras of your life. That is not the end. It's merely, I'm often using doors opening because the only action in Downton Abbey is a door opening or shutting. You walk into a room or you leave a room, so that's it.
And you've certainly got a few doors here.
We've got a few doors here. Never enough, apparently. But it's just another door opening. And it's trying to know that that's a good thing too.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, and now I've retired, people say, what do you do? I'm just so busy. And again, it's helping young people and inspiring people to go out and do great things and living every day to the full. Lynn is often saying, why don't you sit down and have a rest and read a book? But I'm always on the go doing something.
It sounds like she's been your backbone for
Without
years.
doubt, absolutely. And that does come through. Without doubt. I wouldn't have had my career without Lynn. No, she's, like most women in the family, she's been the rock behind us all.
So, John, we've got an event I'm going to create an event, I hope with the help of Smoky Bacon, George Bacon, in 2025, which is, I'm sort of thoughtful from what you're saying, which is I wanted to commemorate the end of the Second World War. It's 80 years next year. So in September, I thought I'd gather as many people as I can here to raise money for those who serve and those who save. And as before, which you may have come to, I'm not sure, called it Heroes at Highclere, because there are many heroes from many walks of life, which make up the totality of what heroism is. Yeah. And it's for different people from around the world. And last time, in 2018, we ended up having the Red Arrows, which was unbelievable. It's so exciting. Wow. But we also had some old planes on another day. We had football, we had music, we had dance. And I asked each of the embassies in London, the Poles contributed a pianist to play the piano in the drawing room. It was so moving. Each embassy can contribute to something else. But I also want to hopefully ask you and the other Concorde pilots, because it's also for young people to come back. My question and thought is, for this particular event, is what did our parents and grandparents think they'd achieved in 1945? And what have we done with their hopes and their dreams today? Yeah. So, and I'd like everyone to leave with a plant or a tree to plant at home. Wow. So that's what I'd like to do. But I hope you'll come back with as many pilots as possible, because I think your life story is inspirational. I will enjoy your book. You will be signing it before you leave here today. And I think the stories of Concorde, just the whole story of the journey of that plane, is one of inspiration, of something you wouldn't have thought was possible. No. That was made possible. John, thank you so much for coming today. You are going to be coming back here, please. I would love to see you again.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's lovely to be back, and I'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Why not join me to enjoy a plethora of fascinating topics, guests and friends from the world of Highclere Castle, the real Downton Abbey. Whether you love movies or care about the planet, wish to discover the best gardening or cooking tips, hear about innovation, music, or the history of flight, I hope you will thoroughly enjoy the library we have created on my podcast page at ladycarnarvon.com.